You are listening to Right the Ship, a podcast about whistleblowers, justice, and democracy, and the case of Lieutenant Commander Kimberly Young-McLear. Right the Ship has been made not only to raise awareness to Commander Young-McLear's pursuit of justice and recognition as a whistleblower, but to also commemorate National Whistleblower Appreciation Day 2023, and the contributions of whistleblowers to democracies in the United States and globally.
Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear, you did your job by blowing the whistle on this, but we need to do ours.
The Coast Guard swept her allegations under the rug.
So the smartest thing for the government to do today is to recognize Commander Young-McLear, give her the apologies she deserves, and right the ship.
We've never had a president or a White House make it an official event.
And so Kim's case is just this shining exemplar of hundreds, if not thousands, of similar cases going on throughout the armed services. Hence why it's such an important battle. It goes far beyond just an individual case.
In 2023, we can expect that most people know what a whistleblower is, in theory. But for avoidance of any doubt, a whistleblower is a person, often an employee, who reveals information about activity within a private or public organization that is deemed illegal, immoral, illicit, unsafe, or fraudulent. What's important to remember about whistleblowers is that at any time, any person, usually in the course of doing their job, can be put in a position to decide to become a whistleblower. It's not surprising, and indeed it's rather obvious, that no person sets out with the career ambition to become a whistleblower, which is compelling when you consider that it can happen to any person at any time. This fact is reflected in our daily news cycles, with major mastheads and local outlets reporting essentially every day on matters that are brought to light by whistleblowers, and sadly, very often the retaliation they face for doing so. That said, it wouldn't be surprising if a lot of your knowledge about whistleblowers comes from acclaimed movies like 1998's Silkwood, 1999's The Insider, or 2010's The Whistleblower. Even just with the passing mention of these three titles, we're acknowledging that whistleblowers have exposed government secrets, corporate misconduct, and widespread corruption. These stories, and the ones that remain untold, truly reflect systemic changes that benefit everyone. These stories reinforce that whistleblowers have brought about improved safety regulations, exposed human rights violations, and led to the recovery of billions of dollars of stolen funds. These movies highlight how whistleblowers have faced threats, retaliation, and even lost their jobs or lives as a result of being a whistleblower. In cases like Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear's, the system of acknowledgement and appreciation of whistleblowers from the government perspective maybe needs to catch up with the way our society tells stories about whistleblowers. It could be said that this is the same with most political issues, but it is certainly the case with Commander Young-McLear. Because between the news, the movies, and courageous vocal whistleblowers like Commander Young-McLear, most, if not all, who blow the whistle will face workplace abuse and loss of job opportunities. In short, their lives will change forever. Cultural norms are also pervasive. Think about things like, anyone who snitches on their superiors doesn't deserve protection. They're a snitch. But without them, employers and government agencies would freely embezzle, abuse their employees, and destroy the lives of the public without consequence. Whistleblowers are essential parts of the workplace and our democracies. Here's Siri Nelson from the National Whistleblowers Center, speaking about the importance of whistleblowers to a functioning democracy.
Whistleblowers are critical to the success of our democracies and to defending the interests of the United States government. So one thing that's important to note is that in the United States, it's a constitutional violation to engage in discrimination. And when whistleblowers speak up about that, they're actually protecting our constitutional values. So when federal whistleblowers speak up about mismanagement and abuse that's occurring within agencies, they're protecting the interests of everyday U.S. taxpayers and the greater U.S. strategy for success. So whistleblowers are an incredible internal oversight mechanism. They've raised a flag about issues that are happening that otherwise are undetectable from the outside. And that's why they should be celebrated, because they're the key to protecting all of the things we value. In terms of how they factor into democracy, the United States has the First Amendment protections, and those protections are directly related to the right to blow the whistle, especially for federal employees, and the value that everyone should be able to speak up and speak their mind without facing any sort of official retribution from the government. Now, this protection is not available in a lot of other countries. Very few constitutions have something that's equivalent to our First Amendment protection, especially the strength that it's given. But every democracy benefits from people who feel comfortable speaking up about their concerns and knowing that they won't face retribution for doing so. It's essential to keeping public debates fair and balanced, and it's also important for mental health across the board. So whistleblowers and the status of whistleblowers is a critical measure for understanding whether we have a functioning democracy and real human rights available to citizens of any country.
As you listen to Right the Ship, keep that critical measure Siri just noted in your mind, because elements of Commander Young-McLear's case speak to an erosion of her rights as a whistleblower. While we will soon be going into the nuances of Commander Young-McLear's case, it has been our long-standing policy at Hand and Heart Media that, unless requested by a participant, we will not go into the granular details of the abusive and traumatic events that they experienced. Simply, no survivor should be forced to relive their trauma in the hope it will, quote, get more people to care. This is because survivor stories are symptomatic of systemic failings and abuses of power that need to be analysed. For Right the Ship, this policy is as poignant as ever. As you're soon to hear, Commander Young-McLear's case goes far beyond the details that made her a whistleblower, and speaks directly to the systemic failings of a corrupted institution. At the heart of her case is an attempted cover-up of her claims, and the punishment that she experienced for coming forward. This podcast focuses on Commander Young-McLear's endeavour to right the ship and to see through her last chance at being acknowledged by a country and government for whom she has sacrificed so much. Because if it were not wrong enough that the United States taxpayers funded the degradation of Commander Young-McLear, they also engaged in a calculated, vexatious campaign against her, an esteemed Coast Guard officer and academic, notably a Black and queer woman. We cannot accept that the Coast Guard of the United States and the various agencies that were aware of this case continue to act as if this was an anomaly filed away, never to be discussed again because they don't feel like it. It's not a good look. That is not the United States brand of democracy that the Biden administration has sold to the world. That's not a system the United States taxpayers should be footing the bill to uphold. That's not a system that will treat you any better should this happen to you. And that cannot be the Coast Guard that the taxpayers fund, the same Coast Guard that proclaims every day, Semper Paratus, always ready. With that, it's time to meet Commander Young-McLear, in her own words, speaking to that sentiment.
But I would argue the Coast Guard was not ready for me. The Coast Guard was not ready for a Black queer woman with a PhD who is kind, compassionate, and ethical. I would argue the Coast Guard was simply not ready for me. And I think that they resorted to retaliation and other forms of psychological abuse and violence because that is what they know. That is what they know. When you talk about individuals without an ounce of integrity combined with power and almost unfettered power or power that is unchecked, right, for years, for decades, that is going to be the outcome. And so when I think about, why do they keep doing it? Isn't it better to just do the right thing? They have the power and the privilege to not care.
There is no professional who becomes a whistleblower who finishes their studies with the ambition to experience professional derailment and personal suffering of great magnitude because they see or experience someone doing something wrong, let alone within a taxpayer-funded organization. Surely, Commander Young-McLear never imagined that the they she mentions, who have the power and privilege not to care, are high-level individuals from the United States military. Ordinarily, a civilian whistleblower will always be in a perpetual state of recovery. In this case, the US military, it's a whole other beast. So one thing that's really important for listeners to keep in mind is that this is about the military. The Coast Guard and whistleblowers in the military are subjected to very different systemic processing than their civilian counterparts. We asked Commander Young-McLear to explain to us how workplace conduct is dealt with differently in the military.
So in ordinary circumstances, say if I'm in the grocery store and someone attacks me, I would call the police and there would be a report filed, charges filed, and it would go through the process from there. So it's really kind of more of an open system. In the U.S. military, we have a closed justice system, or the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And the major difference is that the Coast Guard and the military, they oversee their own justice. So if you are sexually assaulted in the military, that is still adjudicated and investigated by the military.
Let's properly introduce Lieutenant Commander Kimberly Young-McLear. She is currently serving on a fellowship at the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. She has a PhD in Systems Engineering from George Washington University, a Master's in Industrial Administration from Purdue, and a Bachelor's in Industrial Engineering from Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. She is also certified as a project management professional. She credits being an alumni of a historically Black university to her initial education for understanding not only engineering but also systemic racism and how to foster authentically inclusive spaces where everybody can thrive. She entered the Coast Guard through the College Select Pre-Commissioning Initiative. Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear joined the faculty at the United States Coast Guard Academy in 2014 as a member of the Permanent Commission teaching staff. Key aspects of her PhD research about leveraging social media for large-scale disaster response management was adopted by the Coast Guard for 2 historic hurricane seasons, resulting in her team selection for the 2017 Captain Nils Thompson Innovation Award for cultural change. Prior to accepting a position at the Coast Guard Academy, Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear served as a special assistant to the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, where she provided direct support to the Deputy Cabinet Secretary for the development of DHS policy, mission planning, and execution for 240,000 employees. She has been an active leader in the community she has championed for justice, diversity, equality, and inclusion, which resulted in numerous Coast Guard and DoD policy changes to enhancing workforce, climate, and dignity. In 2014, she spearheaded efforts to change Coast Guard grooming policies that adversely affected women of color, becoming the first military branch to model these inclusion standards a year ahead of the Department of Defense Secretary mandate. She previously served as the chair of the Leadership Diversity Advisory Council and member of the Inclusion Excellence Council, which promotes the tenets of civil and human rights, equal opportunity, and public service programs to approximately 1,600 military and civilian personnel. Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear is due to retire from the Coast Guard in 2023. It was in 2015, 1 year after Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear was appointed to the Coast Guard Academy, that she became a whistleblower. In July of 2015 and over the following 18 months, she submitted 5 sets of both informal and formal complaints alleging discrimination and harassment, primarily by the head of her academic department. These complaints were lodged with various officers, including Coast Guard Academy officials, the Coast Guard, Civil Rights Directorate, and even the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security at the time. Some were filed pursuant to formal Coast Guard processes, such as the Military Equal Opportunity Program, while others were made informally with officials. This story needs to be understood in the most basic of terms at first, and that is that the issues not only began when she experienced harassment and bullying at the Coast Guard Academy, but were greatly exacerbated when she reported these issues. The second is that senior officials at the Coast Guard then sought to cover up the substantiation of these complaints. And the third is that Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear faced adverse treatment. Additionally, and the fourth, is that when all of this made it to one of the most notable landmarks of American democracy, Congress and one of their oversight committees, that the Coast Guard took a dismissive and cavalier position. We need to appreciate the magnitude of this case, that it was indeed taken up by Congress. So, considering that there are international listeners, let's make sure, first of all, that we grasp the role of Congress in a situation like this. Congress has the authority to conduct investigations into a wide range of issues and topics, including but not limited to government operations, programs, and activities. These investigations are usually conducted by committees within the House of Representatives or the Senate, and they can be initiated by a request from the member of Congress, a resolution passed by one or both chambers, or by the Speaker of the House, or the Majority Leader of the Senate. Some recent high-profile congressional investigations included the impeachment proceedings against former President Donald Trump, the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, and the investigation into the attack on the US Capitol on January 6, 2021. The results of congressional investigations can have significant implications for policy, politics, and the functioning of government. In short, it's a big fucking deal. Lieutenant Commander Kimberly Young-McLear's case spent 18 months with the Committee on Oversight and Reform and Homeland Security. Congressman Elijah Cummings, then ranking member of the Committee on Oversight and Reform, and Congressman Benny Thompson, then ranking member of the Committee on Homeland Security, in consultation with Representative Joe Courtney from Connecticut, began the investigation to examine how the Coast Guard and Coast Guard Academy handle allegations of harassment and bullying, and whether the Academy creates an inclusive environment that can support equitable outcomes for a diverse student body. Let us now go to this investigation and to the opening remarks of Representative Jamie Raskin. Picking up from the work Representative Cummings had begun.
Today's investigation was spearheaded by Chairman Benny Thompson, who leads the Committee on Homeland Security, and by our own late Chairman Elijah Cummings in close consultation with Connecticut Representative Courtney. Chairman Cummings served as the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee's Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation for 4 years. He was deeply troubled by the results of a 2017 report finding inequitable outcomes for minority cadets, including lower graduation rates and higher levels of discipline. Elijah was also disturbed by the Inspector General's finding that a member of the military assigned to the Coast Guard Academy faculty suffered retaliation for reporting harassment and bullying, and he wanted to know what was being done to address the retaliation and to ensure that the allegations were being handled properly.
The Office of Inspector General, or OIG, is an independent agency within the U.S. federal government that is responsible for preventing fraud, waste, and abuse in federal programs and operations. The OIG conducts audits, investigations, and evaluations of various federal agencies and programs, including the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Department of Health and Human Services, and many others. To understand the outcomes of the OIG's investigation into Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear's case, we're taking you to the testimony of Mr. Jackson Eaton, made before the House Oversight and Reform Committee on the 11th of December, 2019.
In July of 2015, and over the following 18 months, Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear submitted 5 sets of both informal and formal complaints alleging discrimination and harassment at the Coast Guard Academy. Our interest was not in substantiating the merits of these complaints. Rather, it was to examine the Coast Guard's response to them. Primarily, had the Coast Guard, in violation of the Military Whistleblower Protection Act, retaliated against Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear for making these complaints? We found that in one case, it had. Namely, she received low marks on her officer evaluation report. These marks could not be justified by any documented performance issues. Moreover, none of her peers had received a rating as low as hers, and she herself had received higher marks in both prior and subsequent rating periods. In addition to substantiating whistleblower retaliation on the part of certain Academy management officials, our investigation identified several other issues that are relevant to the subcommittee's hearing today. For example, after Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear's second complaint in March 2016, the Coast Guard conducted a preliminary inquiry into her allegations. The investigator performing that inquiry recommended that a full administrative investigation be conducted. However, no such investigation was convened. Instead, Academy officials initiated a more general and relatively superficial climate and culture survey of her academic department. In addition, a similar situation occurred after Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear complained of further harassment and bullying in January 2017. At that time, the Coast Guard conducted an administrative investigation which resulted in an outcome memo issued by a Coast Guard admiral addressing the harassment allegations. While the investigators' conclusions were nuanced, including finding that, quote, there are several instances in which it seems her chain of command is harassing/bullying her, the Admiral's memo characterizing the outcome of that investigation concluded that, quote, the allegations are unsubstantiated. The reasons for this Admiral's decision, as well as a second Admiral's finding that the bullying allegations were also unsubstantiated, are unclear, in part because there was no requirement that commanders document their decision-making in writing. Lastly, although the Coast Guard Civil Rights Manual required complaints of harassment to be treated confidentially to the extent possible, we found that one Academy official continued to discuss Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear and her complaints with colleagues, which may have given the appearance of improper coordination or influence.
At this stage, we really hope that listeners can grasp the magnitude and importance of this case. In fact, you could expect that the highest-ranking officer in the Coast Guard would show up and be there to demonstrate the accountability required of the Coast Guard as an organization in the face of such egregious and concerning findings. The Commandant of the Coast Guard is the service chief and highest-ranking member of the United States Coast Guard. In 2019, this commander was Admiral Carl L. Schultz. Schultz did not show up. Like most powerful white men facing questions they don't want to answer, he was too busy to hear what his organization had allowed to happen to an esteemed and celebrated black queer woman in their ranks. But like all powerful men, he hid because he could. Instead, the Coast Guard sent Vice Admiral Michael F. McAllister. You're gonna love this one.
As a service chief, he has a lot of responsibilities. He has assigned me the responsibilities of delivering a diversity, action, and equity plan for the entire Coast Guard and for, more specifically, for the Coast Guard Academy. So, as an example, just last week, the Commandant and I together presented our draft diversity and inclusion plan for all of the senior leaders in the entire Coast Guard. We brought them all together, and that was agenda item number one. And so he is absolutely committed to it.
Old mate Mickey McAllister there and the Coast Guard care so much about diversity and inclusion and equity that he didn't mention Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear's name once during this testimony. And it's not just us being picky or pedantic or woke. This upset the committee too. Here's Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, too.
Surprised to hear that the Commandant is issuing policies that he is not able or willing to make time to discuss with Congress. Not only is it unacceptable, but it has a profoundly detrimental effect on the Coast Guard's ability to carry out its mission. So clearly the Coast Guard must take additional steps to ensure that service members who blow the whistle are protected from this kind of retaliation. And so I think that's a huge part of what our job and what our role is here today. Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear, you did your job by blowing the whistle on this, but we need to do ours. And we need to make sure that we take this report extremely seriously and make sure that we follow up along with the Inspector General who has substantiated these reports as well. And I know, not just speaking for myself, but for our committee, that's exactly what our intention is. So thank you all very much.
Ultimately, Congress found that the Coast Guard had not held anyone accountable for the failure to promptly, thoroughly, and impartially investigate all of these allegations. Alarmingly, the committee also found that black cadets had been subjected to substantially higher rates of discipline and passed courses at lower rates than their peers. In July 2019, 45% of female cadets reported that they had experienced sexual harassment, an 11% increase from what was reported in 2016. The committee confirmed that documents they reviewed reinforced their concerns regarding the climate and culture at the Academy, which educates the future leaders of the Coast Guard and is central to the service's efforts to set and reinforce its values. Their recommendation was that the Academy must make major reforms to address disparities and improve its culture. We hope there are no doubts as to why it is so important to talk about this case at this specific juncture where Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear prepares to retire from the service. We hope there is no doubt as to why the hostility from this organization needs to be addressed. And there needs to be acknowledgement. And there needs to be acknowledgement from the United States government beyond this hearing. Otherwise, it is incredibly clear that Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear is yet to be made whole by the democracy that she has served now for over 20 years. That's why, on January 16th, 2023, the National Whistleblowers Center, Protect Our Defenders, the Modern Military Association of America, Whistleblowers of America, and Walk the Talk Foundation sent a letter to the United States President Joseph Biden, calling on him to recognize and correct the harms against federal whistleblower Lieutenant Commander Kimberly Young-McLear.
Dear Mr. President, we write to express our urgency to advance accountability, dignity, and legislation for and brought forth by whistleblowers. As justice-seeking advocates, we were encouraged by your anti-corruption strategy, which mentions whistleblowers, recently achieved quorum at the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the passing of several whistleblower laws in 2022, including the Money Laundering Whistleblower Improvement Act. Current whistleblower programs have proven the incredible impact whistleblowers can have on ensuring market integrity, and now we call for you to recognize the impact federal whistleblowers have on government integrity and effective oversight. Federal whistleblowers need your attention now, and Lieutenant Commander Kimberly Young-McLear, who has served for 19 years, is still seeking justice. Will you be the president courageous enough to grant her this justice and show government officials throughout the United States that their commander-in-chief will not tolerate the abuse of its employees and whistleblowers?
The letter goes on to detail. Protecting whistleblowers is a core part of US history and values. Commander Young-McLear is an exemplary service member. That retaliation against Commander Young-McLear has broad impacts, and that accountability is the only path to integrity. The letter then asks, make an example of Commander McLear and set the record straight on workplace abuses and retaliation.
The seas of change are upon us. Whistleblowers are becoming increasingly high profile. News stories of your State of the Union commendation of courage of whistleblowers and invitation of whistleblower Frances Haugen sparked conversation across America. Exemplary whistleblowers are changing the narrative on blowing the whistle and the role we can play on an individual level to stand up for democracy and integrity. Make an example of Commander Young-McLear, like you did Frances Haugen. Just as you sent a message to the tech industry that no one is above the law, so should you send the message to federal employees who report to you. Command written apologies for Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear. Ensure her professional military record accurately reflects her vast contributions to the nation. Publicly convene with whistleblower advocates and establish National Whistleblower Day as a federal day of observance. Only you, President Biden, are capable of doing this.
We heard from Siri Nelson of the National Whistleblowers Center earlier, and now we're going to hear from Jackie Garrick of Whistleblowers of America, the organization Miss Garrick founded. Jackie Garrick is a policy and program expert with 30 years of service to the military and veteran community. She was a political appointee at the Pentagon for 8 years, setting up personnel programs for wounded warriors and the Defense Suicide Prevention Office. She established the crisis hotline in Afghanistan and later investigated issues related to diversity and inclusion and No Fear Act violations. While working for the Defense Department, Jackie Garrick blew the whistle on fraud, waste, and abuse, and suffered retaliation. We asked her what she thought about the actions of Commander Young-McLear as a whistleblower.
Yeah, so I think what she has done is very brave, but also very honest. And it comes from a position of really believing in doing the right thing. You know, when we study whistleblowers and we look at what motivates them, we look at, so is this courageous act? Is this an act of virtue? What gets somebody to that point? And I think what Commander McLear did is she recognized that this was happening to her, and she was of significant rank, of position, well-educated. But what about everybody else who might not have the voice that she found? And I think when somebody like her speaks up for herself, she's also speaking up for those of us in the collective. So I may not walk in her shoes, but I've been in the military. I'm a former Army officer as well. And when she does what she's done, she uplifts everybody. And when there is a culture of racism or misogyny or any toxic kind of culture that discriminates, harasses its employees, then you have to speak up because it's an entire culture that is being impacted, whether you see it or not, whether you feel it or not, whether you know it or not. It exists and it is impacting coworkers or colleagues, maybe not above you, but those below you that don't have the vision and the voice for everything that's going on in an organization. They're on the lower rungs of the ladder, right? Where it's more crowded, less view, less voice. It's hard to hear the voices at the bottom rung of the ladder when you're on the top rung of the ladder. So you need those people that are on the ladder that pull everybody else up with them. And I truly believe that's what she's done and is trying to do. And without accountability for any of the acts of perpetration, whether they be corruption or discrimination, without that accountability, without that transparency, we all lose and we don't have better systems and we don't improve our culture and we keep repeating the same mistakes. So I think what she's done is trying to change the conversation from a larger scope for everybody.
Walk the Talk Foundation has a mission to give military members a voice when and where they don't have one, guiding them through the treacherous waters of whistleblowing, working towards a vision to realize a military free from reprisal and retribution. Walk the Talk Foundation was founded by retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Swayze, who served in the active duty Air Force until his retirement in 2022, while assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency from 2017 to 2020. He experienced firsthand the rampant dysfunction of the Department of Defense Inspector General as his and dozens of other SAS Inspector General complaints fell through the cracks of an ineffective and corrupt organization. During that time, Swayze collated over 70 witness statements and produced a report to Congress highlighting the systemic failings of both the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Department of Defense Inspector General. This report would serve to be the centerpiece of a February 2022 article by the Wall Street Journal, which brought attention to the breadth and depth of the corruption in the military avenues of recourse, culminating in the passing of the 2023 Intelligence Authorization Act. When we had a chance to speak with Ryan, he spoke very clearly about the consequences we will face if we don't start rectifying the systems that process cases like Commander Young-McLear's.
This case, and really the reason for my foundation in a holistic sense, really comes down to what I believe the capacity for our armed services to defend the nation in the future. I don't believe that's exaggerated, and I'll tell you why they're linked. We are suffering right now from an incredible trust deficit in our armed services. For a myriad of reasons, but one of those is this breach of trust caused by broken promises like the ones you see in Kim's case. Mm-hmm. The system promised her protection, promised her justice, promised her restitution, delivered none of those. Mm-hmm. And in all the cases that I deal with in my foundation, all the clients, it's sadly the same story, which is they were told justice would be served, and it wasn't. Mm-hmm. And that creates and then widens this trust gap. The ramifications of that are we start to bleed our already recruited talent. And the second order effect is we have difficulty recruiting that talent to replace them. And we're seeing that now. Quantitatively, you can see that throughout the U.S., not only in polls in terms of the decline in America's trust in our military institution, but as well as the decline in recruiting numbers.
Yeah.
That trend is going to lead us to this inevitable end state in which we won't be capable of defending the nation. And that's ultimately what this whole thing is about.
The Biden administration has not acknowledged the letter sent by these organizations you have just heard from in support of Commander Young-McLear. Nor has the administration invited her to the White House for events on National Whistleblower Appreciation Day 2023. However, since this campaign launched in January, there have been some notable news and a notable event, but nothing that equates to the justice sought by the collective unit and the letter that they have written. First, we must exemplify the work of Congressman Benny Thompson, who you will recall initiated the investigation back in 2018 alongside Elijah Cummings. On June 12, 2023, Ranking Member Benny Thompson of the House Homeland Security Committee entered Commander Young-McLear's career highlights from her 20-plus years of service into the congressional record. This is an important acknowledgement. Commander Young-McLear, as a whistleblower, has been prevented by leadership of the Coast Guard from having her work contributions recognized in the last 9 years. I wish I could say that the news events were good, or went some way to seeing that this campaign would succeed. Unfortunately, they don't. On March 16, 2023, CNN reported, "Failed oversight, lax punishments. How the Coast Guard has allowed sexual assault at sea to go unchecked." In summary, the article puts forth the following. There was a secret investigation named Operation Fouled Anchor into alleged sexual abuse at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, and this investigation revealed a history of rapes, assaults, and misconduct being ignored or covered up by high-ranking officials. Despite credible evidence of assaults dating back to the late 1980s, most alleged perpetrators were not criminally investigated but faced minor administrative punishments or were allowed to continue serving in the military. Some of the accused individuals rose to top roles at the Coast Guard and other military agencies. The article points out that, on the other hand, many alleged victims left the academy after reporting their assaults, ending their career aspirations in the service. The investigation raised questions about the current culture at the academy and the Coast Guard's struggle to hold suspected sexual predators accountable. The probe identified over 60 substantiated incidences of rape, sexual assault, and harassment committed by academy cadets or others that occurred at the academy. Academy officials routinely failed to report serious allegations to law enforcement and avoided the criminal justice system. Alleged victims were blamed for contributing to their assaults, while the suspected perpetrators had their conduct minimized and excused. Operation Fouled Anchor resulted in no punishments for the Academy's leadership, and some alleged victims felt upset and frustrated with the investigation's outcome. And yet, it gets worse. On June 30, 2023, CNN also reported, criminal investigation into the Coast Guard Academy revealed years of sexual assault cover-ups, but findings were kept secret. So this article does indeed touch on Operation Fouled Anchor, but brings to light the revelations of a third-party contractor who experienced rape while training at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, and subsequently filed a lawsuit against the ship's operator, with the case being settled for an undisclosed amount. However, the Coast Guard has not taken any disciplinary action against the alleged perpetrator, and his credential was renewed. Sounds familiar. In reviewing these latest articles, I can't help but be reminded of a New York Times piece from 2021 that Commander Young-McLear sent to me, and the all too familiar devastation of trauma when it's represented by numbers. In this article, they note, women remain a distinct minority in armed services, making up only 16.5% of the armed services. Yet, nearly 1 in 4 service women reports experiencing sexual assault in the military, and more than half report experiencing harassment, according to the meta-analysis of 69 studies published in 2018 and in the journal Trauma, Violence, and Abuse. In a 2019 study, scientists at the Denver Veterans Affairs Medical Center and the University of Utah and University of Colorado surveyed more than 300 service women and female veterans who had experienced sexual assault and found that 29% were currently contemplating suicide. From 2007 to 2017, the age-adjusted suicide rate among female veterans rose by 73%. According to Department of Defense data, in 2019, women accounted for 31% of all suicide attempts among active duty service members. I think what's important to note here is that Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear was one of the first active duty Coast Guard members to have a substantiated case of retaliation. So when you look at this case, when you consider the 2 articles that have come out since the launch of Commander Young-McLear's letter and campaign to right the ship just this year, and you consider that everything we've heard since that campaign not only reinforces her experiences but the state of military as a whole, then we can really appreciate the significance of the Right the Ship campaign in its entirety. We're bringing back Ryan Swayze from Walk the Talk Foundation to speak to this.
The campaign is, and we've alluded to this already, far more beyond just the case of an individual who was wronged and who did not receive timely justice. It's about our culture. It's about an unsettling trend within our armed services. And it's about, ultimately, the defense of democracy. Mm-hmm. Commander Young-McLear's case is really just a reflection of so many others that are going on right now in our military, both Coast Guard as well as Department of Defense. Mm-hmm. The unseen enemy from those other thousands of cases is the breach in trust that's slowly festering and will eventually manifest itself in the future in inadequate ability to defend the nation. Mm-hmm. So this is an important case because it is a turning point. It is an opportunity for the government to right the ship as well as walk the talk regarding its promise to its service members that they will be protected from retribution and reprisal and that they will be served justice when they are victimized.
And here's Siri Nelson, who we also met earlier. Siri Nelson is the executive director of the National Whistleblower Center and an adjunct professor at Northeastern University School of Law. She also talks about the importance of Commander Young-McLear's campaign.
Yeah, so this is a major case, and part of the reason why NWC has decided to support it is because when you have someone who is such a powerhouse like Commander Young-McLear is, they are essentially unstoppable. So that's point number one. She's going to keep fighting for the justice she seeks until she gets it. So the ramifications for the U.S. government, are that they're going to have to keep on hearing from her until she gets what she wants. So the smartest thing for the government to do today is to recognize Commander Young-McLear, give her the apologies she deserves, and right the ship. But if they choose not to do that this year, they'll keep hearing from her. And as a perfect example of an unstoppable whistleblower, she is able to change the culture, which she's already done as a federal employee. She's already a mentor and an example for other federal employees about what integrity and inclusion looks like in the federal government. And she's going to continue to do that. But when someone like her so publicly takes this action, especially as a whistleblower and on behalf of whistleblower rights and the need to recognize whistleblower contributions, she is helping to change the culture and set the tone and let the U.S. government know that they cannot get away with half measures. They cannot get away with ignoring those who are guilty of engaging in retaliation, and they cannot silence unstoppable whistleblowers like Commander Young-McLear. So the implications are that we're seeing a cultural shift, and she's at the forefront of it, and the U.S. government is going to have to take heed now or later. The public should be aware that a person should be protected from retaliation without having to be a warrior like Kimberly Young-McLear is. She has incredible strength that is difficult to find from anyone in any profession. She has a level of integrity that is unimpeachable, which a lot of us grapple with. Individuals should be protected when they decide to speak up about wrongdoing, and it should be widely recognized that usually when people make that choice, it's because of something larger at stake. They are doing it for the greater good. Maybe their understanding of what's best for the greater good might be different than yours, but almost every whistleblower comes from a positive place and deserves protection and recognition. In places where anonymity, anti-retaliation, protections, confidentiality, and rewards are not available for whistleblowers, sometimes the best thing they can get is social support. The SHIP campaign is a way to show that social support, but you can change your life and change the lives of whistleblowers every day by having compassion for those around you who have the courage to speak up.
Here's Jackie Garrick again from Whistleblowers of America, also speaking about the Right the Ship campaign.
So I think the importance of this campaign is to make Whistleblower Awareness Day, July 30th in the US, to make it a recognized every year event. Make this a proclamation that doesn't have to come before Congress every year. Senator Grassley, for years and years now, has introduced it. We have a proclamation each year, but we've never had a president or a White House make it an official event. There's never been like an executive order that I'm aware of anyway that has invited whistleblowers to the White House for a Rose Garden ceremony and make this an official understood event.
And here's Paul Pearson, who is the vice president for Whistleblowers of America, the organization Jackie founded. Paul has personally experienced retaliation after being forced to leave his contracting position in 2019. This was a result of reporting corporate espionage to the head of insider threats while working for the Army's high-performance computing grant. Paul has 15 years of experience in IT, security, and innovation under his belt, 10 years of knowledge and experience, as well as 5 years of leadership management.
I mean, it just really highlights how far we haven't come in addressing these issues.
Yes.
It's very common for these things to be written in text. You know, the laws and regulations on how these things should be, addressed. But it just definitely highlights how the military doesn't actually, or government in a lot of cases, just in general, doesn't carry out. They don't back up what they say. I feel like the public has to know that, like, in order for us to really progress, like for humanity to progress, this issue has to be like addressed, because we can only sweep it under the rug for so long. But when you want actual change in society, like everybody wants change when it comes to, like, education, government, but like policing, especially.
Yes.
There was a good whistleblower roundtable we had for the law enforcement, and there was a lot of great officers in there, but there just isn't any actual whistleblowing laws in place for them in a lot of states.
What you may have noticed about Jackie, Paul, and Ryan is that they are whistleblowers themselves. They have gone into their communities after these experiences to do work, public people work. What stands out to me about this is that there are so very few support systems for whistleblowers when they come forward. And that is exemplified not in the honorable work that these people that we've spoken to have gone on to do, but in the fact that they had to create what they did not have. Paul shared some interesting insights into the work that Whistleblowers of America do, which focuses really on peer-to-peer support.
So, Whistleblowers of America, our main focus is peer-to-peer support. We're one of the few whistleblowing organizations that does peer support for whistleblowers. So essentially, it's like whistleblowers supporting other whistleblowers, because even for a therapist, it's hard to really like understand what somebody's going through when they blow the whistle. A lot of industries are completely different, but like the ways in retaliation, they generally like happen. Like retaliation generally happens like differently per industry, more or less,
Yeah.
and it's just difficult for people to really understand how to empathize with it.
Jackie elaborates on this concept further and the work of her organization.
So peer support is an evidence-based practice that is really based on the concept that lived experience matters, and that if you take people like veterans who have all been in a combat zone, spouses who have lost a loved one, police officers, other law enforcement, fire, rescue, and they bond over the commonality of their experience. Well, I thought we could do the same thing with a hostile work environment. And I've developed some templates around the idea that we needed a taxonomy for whistleblowers to understand what they're experiencing so they understand the nature of their trauma. So I've developed a whistleblower retaliation checklist that I use or I help people use when they go through court cases, but we help them make decisions, solve problems, and remain resilient through the peer support by just sort of understanding what's going on for them, making decisions, letting them ventilate. Somebody once said, the most important thing anybody ever said to me was, I believe you, because of the gaslighting. And I have what I call the toxic tactics of retaliation that starts with gaslighting, mobbing, marginalizing, shunning, devaluing, double binding, career blocking, counter-accusing, and bullying. And so by understanding those domains and understanding how they affect you. So as I started to say, if somebody is being gaslit, gaslighting causes somebody to have self-doubts, ruminate, think about their case over and over, have intrusive thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks. Well, those are all symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So we help them understand those conditions. We help them with advocacy if they need to connect with elected officials, the media, if they need a therapist, because sometimes you just need a long-term therapeutic relationship. We help support them with their families. It's all about making the right decision for you.
Here's Ryan Swayze again, talking about the work of the Walk the Talk Foundation.
Mm-hmm. The first and foremost thing that a whistleblower, which is usually a victim of some kind of abuse or wrongdoing, who then becomes a complainant in the system, is not afforded any representation, counsel, advocacy, anything along those lines. So my foundation attempts to, with my team of about 12 experts, fill in the gaps in a process that's incredibly bureaucratically laden, many times convoluted, and oftentimes the complainant is left to fend for themselves. They have no one in their corner, so to speak, and that's where my foundation attempts to fill in. So not only guiding them along the process, which is at times esoteric and confusing, but also just being their advocate when the government is not. That's the first facet of the foundation. And the second one is the advocacy piece. And our objective in that regard is to bring about substantive change to the system, whether it be legal, regulatory, both, cultural, perhaps. And in that regard, we engage with the Congress and other advocacy groups to bring about this holistic, substantive change while we're continuing our mission of the one-on-one advisement with our individual clients.
And here's Siri Nelson again, talking about the work of the National Whistleblowers Center.
We are a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. in the United States. We were started in 1988 to advocate for whistleblowers and their rights. At that time, whistleblower law was very confusing, and thanks to our efforts, it's become a lot more clear. And right now we're focused on policy initiatives, including the Right to Shift campaign.
The work of these individuals and these organizations is impactful. It has to be said. But having this kind of an impact doesn't always equate to justice. And that is, of course, at the heartbeat of Kim's case as well. The tragic reality for most whistleblowers is that their cases seem to disappear somehow. And I guess that can happen when no one wants to talk about it. But if no one wants to talk about it, no one's really supporting the people that it happened to. And if no one wants to talk about it, it's because it hasn't been resolved properly. It begs the question, what happens when cases like Commander Young-McLear's do not go addressed? When the justice that they seek, that they outline will make them whole, is not provided? Here's Paul Pearson again, with a very realistic assessment.
I mean, justice hasn't been served for a lot of whistleblowers for a lot of time, for a long period of time. And I mean, I hope that something comes from this, but I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm not terribly optimistic that that ramifications of something will actually come from this.
Why do you say that?
Because I've heard so many different stories,
Yeah.
and certain stories have brought me to like straight tears instantly, because it's just so clear to me. It's just like money over anything. I think that we're getting closer to figuring out how to address these issues, but I don't know if we're there yet. I'm hoping
Yeah.
that something comes from this case, though.
Here's Ryan Swayze again.
There is of course, a procedural element to this whole thing, which is difficult, but there's also an emotional, psychological toll, especially because these cases just languish. We're going to talk more about Commander Young-McLear's case, which has been veritably dying on the vine for the past 5+ years, which doesn't deliver justice, but it also doesn't afford complainants, subjects, victims, what have you, any closure. So in that process, not only are they not moving on, but sometimes they're reliving it as the investigation opens and reopens, and there's delays. And so I try and assist in that regard as well. We have partnerships with some mental health agencies. We also have a psychologist on the staff who assists in a non-formal manner. But there is that human side too, where you're just a friend and an ally and an advocate as these people march along this path veritably alone.
Finally, here's Jackie Garrick.
So we know what happens when justice isn't delivered, right? Criminals go free. But then there are also the things that we don't maybe recognize every day. So one of the things I cite, a couple of things that I like to cite, is first of all, corruption is 5% of the global GDP is lost. That's trillions of dollars every year. That means that our balanced budget in the US is not balanced. And when we look at raising the debt ceiling, we're having that conversation as we speak, right? The president's budget has just been released in the US, and we're looking at having to raise the debt ceiling. Well, whistleblowers help return money to the Treasury. When they win their cases at the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission, money comes back into the US Treasury. When corporations have to reimburse, right? Shareholders have lost money. Those are individuals who have been harmed by these faceless, massless corporations, governments that have this immunity because they're anonymous. Well, by holding them accountable and by chipping away at that lack of transparency and that accountability, we make a big difference for how our governments and our corporations function. On the other end of the spectrum, when we allow retaliation to fester, we are forgetting about the psychosocial impacts of that. And one of the other things, again, that we look at from Whistleblowers of America perspective is this mental health piece. Another data point that I find is important in this is suicide is the 4th leading cause of death among working-aged adults. 4th leading cause of death, working-age adults. What's the correlation to the workplace in those suicides? We're always quick to blame the interpersonal relationships or, they've gotten divorced or they broke up with somebody. But what about when your abuser is your employer and the hostile work environment you're dealing with is your workspace? We don't do a good enough job looking at those factors in suicide. And yet on one end of the spectrum, we know that socioeconomic status and loss of income and loss of identity can very well be associated with suicide. So we talk about wanting to prevent suicide in this country, and it's the, depending upon the age groups we're talking about, second and third leading cause of death among military and veteran populations. So here's somebody like Commander McLear, who comes out of this military culture and background, who's trying to change culture, and yet we don't see that what happens when you discriminate and harass and you're misogynistic and you don't support the LGBTQA community, that all of those things are what contribute to your suicide portfolio. So you can want to have a zero suicide campaign. You can want to reduce overdoses by drugs. But if you're not dealing with the underlying causes of those problems, you're never going to stop the suicide, you're never going to stop the drug overdoses, and you're never going to improve your culture. So from two ends of that spectrum, I see where our financial losses as governments and corporations and our individual and interpersonal losses come together to really create and snowball these problems.
I don't really want to live in a society that relies on people changing the course of their life and the work that they do to provide support that our governments have promised us they would provide, that our workplaces have promised us they would provide. I think we can say at this point that the Coast Guard and perhaps a lot of the military and government organizations in the United States simply don't appreciate whistleblowers, literally or figuratively, or at least as their platitudes seem to intend. Apart from the work of Senator Grassley every year around whistleblowers, and Congressman Thompson's efforts to have Commander Young-McLear's record put into Congress, the United States government has not recognized Kim's plight. And in essence, they're not really recognizing the plight of all whistleblowers. As the United States celebrates National Whistleblower Appreciation Day on July 30th, we really have to question why the appropriate proclamations have not been issued, and why, as Commander Young-McLear is set for retirement, the issues she brought to light appear to have impacted countless other Coast Guard members and third-party workers. It brings us to an inflection point, as we've just covered. What are the ramifications of justice not being served in Commander Young-McLear's case? Hopefully, you're wondering how you can support Commander Young-McLear, and we've got those details in our show notes. Be sure to check them right there at the top. There's a link. You can't miss it. Do that. You can still sign the letter, and we can still make it known on this National Whistleblower Appreciation Day how much we do support and value the whistleblowers who serve us. I wanted to leave you with the final words from Commander Young-McLear. I met her in San Francisco last year, and she delivered a presentation. You'll have to excuse the quality, therefore, of the recording, but I think what Commander Young-McLear says is so important and so relevant, and the perfect note to leave you on. It's a note that I hope encourages you, the listener, to take some initiative and to take some action on behalf of Commander Young-McLear, but whistleblowers everywhere, for the contributions they make to the societies we live in.
What did I survive? So I will do the best I can to kind of walk you all through what I have experienced, what I've seen, and ultimately, because I'm here, what I've survived. I'm going to walk through a series of slides that will have numbers on the slides. As I display the numbers, I really am inviting you all to really just kind of sit with the numbers, process what those numbers actually mean, and then I'll continue through the rest of the presentation. So the very first number, 2,899 days. That is the duration of time since I first filed my complaint of harassment. I'm in the U.S. military, I'm in the Coast Guard, and stationed in Connecticut, serving as a college professor. And unfortunately, I was working in a hostile work environment and I endured and witnessed a lot of forms of psychological violence. So 2,899 days ago, from this date today, is when I actually filed my first complaint, meaning at this time I was already experiencing harassment. I didn't file a complaint on the first day of work. So just again, as I present these numbers, I invite you all to just kind of sit with these numbers and really what it actually means in terms of time. 1,387 days ago, the Homeland Security, which is my parent department where I work for the U.S. government, federal government, they actually substantiated my claims and allegations. So again, this is 1,387 days ago. The Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General, they have federal investigative powers, and they investigated my claims of retaliation and they substantiated it. To also kind of put this in contrast, as a military officer in the Coast Guard, to my knowledge, I believe I was actually the first Coast Guard person to actually have knowledge that you can actually file a complaint through the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General's office, and it actually was substantiated. In terms of probability, you all probably know this really well. It is incredibly difficult. There's a very high legal bar to show for these types of independent investigations. The statistics are somewhere around 1% substantiation rate, so it's incredibly low. 1,387 days ago, the Inspector General substantiated my claims of retaliation. 1,016 days ago, the U.S. Congress, specifically the House of Representatives, they launched a joint investigation, and this actually marks the date of when their report was released. It's actually online, and I highly encourage everyone to read it. But 1,016 days ago today, U.S. Congress, House of Representatives, two separate committees working jointly together with two subcommittees, launched an investigation into the Coast Guard, and they substantiated my claims of harassment, workplace bullying, discrimination, and retaliation. So again, I'm inviting everyone to just really kind of sit with the duration of these dates. To frame this another way, what does this really mean? So altogether, working in this environment at the Coast Guard Academy as a military officer, 8 admirals, 2 federal executives, and 15 other senior officials and their lawyers, their HR, management, and so forth, were all found to be complicit, had knowledge, and did everything in their power, as I'm about to literally laugh, did everything in their power, right, to attempt to harm me, destroy me, right? But they were found guilty. So if you kind of think of the magnitude, not just in terms of time, but also in terms of scale and scope. In the Coast Guard, you may see images online, perhaps, of people jumping out of helicopters, and we're kind of known for being very humanitarian in that sense and saving lives, right? But that wasn't necessarily my experience, as you can see. So what started off as a department head at an academic institution harassing me and bullying me, I went through these administrative processes internally, and unfortunately, which is not going to be a shock to any of you in this room and those online, when the Coast Guard, through their administrative process, they would assign their own investigator, and that investigator was not impartial. The investigator had a personal relationship with the bully, with the perpetrator, and the perpetrator essentially was vindicated every single time. And when you have bullies that are vindicated through their own administrative processes, that doesn't compel them to cease their behavior. It actually invites the opposite. They actually become more emboldened. So every time I would file through these processes, I was offered an opportunity. I could file again for the retaliation that I just experienced. I could do nothing and continue to suffer, or I suppose I could have resigned my commission, left my entire career behind, and I suppose find another job elsewhere as I try and put the pieces together with my mental health and resources and so forth. So those were pretty much the options in front of me. And there's an old phrase my mom used to say growing up, it's something about picking your battles. I think I probably lost the point of why she was sharing this, because I picked every battle. But joking aside, in my family, we were raised to do the right thing. I honestly do not like to see anyone suffering. And I think to a large extent, suffering is quite frankly unnecessary. And so if something is wrong,
We should do something about it to the best of our ability.
Lieutenant Commander Young-McLear, you did your job by blowing the whistle on this, but we need to do ours.
The Coast Guard swept her allegations under the rug.
So the smartest thing for the government to do today is to recognize Commander Young-McLear, give her the apologies she deserves, and right the ship.
We've never had a president or a White House make it an official event.
And so Kim's case is just this shining exemplar of hundreds, if not thousands, of similar cases going on throughout the armed services. Hence why it's such an important battle. It goes far beyond just an individual